Hey everyone, welcome back to the CrossWinds Church More Than Sunday podcast. This is Chris Coli. I'm the senior pastor here at CrossWinds, and got another fun episode for you today. We're going to do tough questions. Real quick, we did not put out a podcast yesterday. That's the first time we have not done that since the shelter in place. It was Cinco de Mayo. I just needed a day off. So we are back, and we're going to be doing this one today with Jodie Tey, our associate pastor, Matt VanGent, our executive pastor, and we are tackling a really tough question about whether the stories in the Old Testament, whether each one of them are factual. So enjoy this. All right, we're here with another episode of these tough questions. I've got Jodie, our associate pastor. Hey, Jodie.
Oh, hi.
Matt VanGent, our executive pastor. We are going to be talking with him as well. Hi, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. We got another tough question today we're going to try to tackle here. But before we do, how's it going? Guys, it's May 6th that we're recording this. How was your Cinco de Mayo? What'd you do last night?
Ours was delicious. My wife Erin made homemade tortillas. We had tacos with guacamole. It was delicious. We still had our Taco Tuesday and Cinco de Mayo even at home.
Homemade tortillas. What in the world is that? How do you even do that?
You mix up the
Do you have a conveyor belt in your house, like at a tortilleria? We have
a 5-year-old who loves to cook in the kitchen.
Awesome.
And flatten things. You just tell her it's Play-Doh.
We got a tortilla press on Amazon when this whole thing started, and it was delicious.
I love that about you guys. Hey, we have a shelter in place. What are we going to do? Quickly get on Amazon and look for a tortilla press.
We're making tortillas.
We couldn't get toilet paper, so we settled for tortillas.
Tortilla press. I like it.
Awesome.
How about you, Jodie? What'd you guys do last night?
We kind of dined al fresco by our pool and listened to some Latino music and
nice.
Had
That's
some
good.
Moscow mules.
Okay, that's good.
Chips and guac.
I love that. I made guacamole last night, and I did not have my usual ingredients. So I went back. I did my mom's recipe when I was a kid, this is a total Midwestern version of guacamole. You ready? It's avocados, obviously smashed up to be guacamole, and garlic salt.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's the plainest, most boring guacamole ever, but it actually tastes pretty good.
Did anyone's mom ever put mayonnaise in their guacamole?
Thank God, no.
My mom used to put mayonnaise and chili powder in her guacamole.
Mayonnaise? What is she, like, trying to make deviled eggs with it? What is
I started to do that as an adult, and my husband was like, what are you doing right now?
Yeah, that's terrible sounding. I could see maybe a sour cream mixed in or something, but mayonnaise.
Isn't that weird?
Your mom from Arkansas? Did you tell me that at one point? That explains it. That explains it. Yeah, we came over to the church. So last year, about a year ago this time, we were in Puerto Vallarta. We went on a spring break Puerto Vallarta trip with some friends, Jeff and Jamie Melvin. And Quinn had bought a GoPro. She'd saved up for like 2 years to buy a GoPro, took all this footage, and then spent the last year editing. It took her that long to edit all of the footage together, and our hope was going to be to at the 1 year mark actually spend some time watching this thing together when it was finally done. Now we've got the shelter in place, so how do you do that? What's the plan? They watch it in their home, we watch it in our home. So it hit me, we have a giant auditorium. What if I get in there and on our big center screen we play Quinn's 20-minute Puerto Vallarta video while we're on opposite sides of the room, so socially distant that there's no risks. So we went and we all got tacos at taquerias, although we had to go to multiple taquerias. It was so crowded last night at Mexican food restaurants. And then we came over here and we watched our, here, because I'm at church right now in my office. I shouldn't be saying that. We came over here and we watched it. It's pretty fun.
That's awesome.
Good Cinco de Mayo.
So fun.
There may or may not have been a party going on in our courtyard where someone was making margaritas, and I may or may not have borrowed one from them. So no names will be shared, but I guess if the church is shut down, why not?
What else are you going to do?
Yeah, the person was in law enforcement, so I felt like it was probably okay.
There you go.
So, guys, but when I say party, let me just be quick. I think they were also be quick to say they were socially distancing. I don't want to give the impression there are 50
Right.
people in our parking lot.
Right.
All right. Tough question for today. You ready for it? Should we talk
Yes.
this one through a little bit?
Let's go.
This is one that was submitted, and here's the question. Are all of the stories, all was capitalized, are all of the stories in the Old Testament factual, and how could they be? Specifically, Noah's Ark, Jonah in the whale. Now, I'll just say, before we try to answer this, we've not talked about this together so far, the three of us. I thought it would probably make for a more interesting podcast for us to not hear each other's answers to this. We may all agree with each other. We may all disagree. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Are all of the stories in the Old Testament factual? What do you do with that?
Well, that's so easy. Just kidding. Oh my God.
Yeah, Dr. Jodie Tey, what is your take?
Well, I borrow someone else's take on this one.
Okay.
When I was in seminary, I read a book called Theology of the Old Testament, Testimony, Dispute, and Advocacy. That was the tagline.
Okay.
And the author used like this metaphor and imagery of a courtroom trial. Like the Old Testament is just this one big, long courtroom trial scene, like a Law and Order courtroom scene where various people or people groups are giving their testimony, like a series of claims that they're asserting about God, the God of Israel, right? And so there's many voices presenting their interpretation. And so his whole thing is that the entire Old Testament is not about acts or history, although there's a lot of history in the Old Testament, but it's about Israel's like utterances and testimony regarding God. And so that's why he kind of uses this courtroom scene, because some people are testifying, some people are disputing, and some are like standing up for God in whatever story that they're telling. And so within that, he says, well, as someone is telling their story, there's kind of levels of truth within each story. There could be factual truth, physical truth. There could be meaning of life truth, and there could be like wisdom, truth for living. So there are like these different levels of truth within this advocacy. And so like that's how I've kind of approached my reading of the Old Testament, whether I'm sitting there going, was this true or not? I think that I'm trying to discern like, why is this story here? And what is it telling me about God rather than, did this really happen? Is this factual? Is this so maybe it's a metaphor teaching me something. Maybe it's something else. I don't know.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, your answer to this would stem from an understanding that some of this might be more factual than other parts of it, very much based around what they're trying to accomplish in the courtroom. Am I getting that right?
Yes, exactly. It's based on what they're trying to accomplish in the courtroom. So their story or their testimony is either I'm defending God in this, or I am pointing a finger at God in this, or I'm just telling you my story about my experience of who I've experienced God to be in this. So, yeah.
Okay. So knowing that that's your answer, well, Matt, you look like you're about to say something. Let me pause.
Well, we can go back to Jodie's answer first. I don't need to.
Okay.
Interject yet.
So Jodie, knowing that's the case, Noah's Ark, what's that for in the courtroom?
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm just kidding. That's a good question. It's a good question. I think even in myself, I've gone back and forth. Like, did it really happen? Did the flood really happen? Is there evidence for it? Or is this just a metaphor for God reacting to a humanity that's gone a little wacko? And is it also a story, a metaphor or a story that explains God's mercy in the end, like I will never do this again? And are those the lessons I'm supposed to take from it? Or did this thing really happen? Did God really wipe it out? That could very well be someone's interpretation of how God might respond to something versus this actually happened.
Yeah, I think what is probably a key part of what you're saying in this courtroom kind of analogy, we can't quite know what the purpose was behind their courtroom testimony. I think is probably a piece of that. And so which parts were meant to defend God, which parts were meant to teach a lesson, which parts were, yeah, that's good. All
Yeah,
right.
and so I think there's a lot of different, as you even approach one story, there's so many possible even interpretations within that. And that
Yeah.
we put those truths in between, those layers of truth in between ourselves and the Bible. And
Mm-hmm.
so we bring whatever our baggage is or our story or idea of truth is to those layers of interpretation and then to the Bible. And so it just is
Yeah.
it can be complicated, but to say that this is absolutely what's happening here, I don't know.
Yeah. What would you say to that, Matt? What are your thoughts on her explanation there?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jodie, and I have a far less eloquent way of putting it.
Please,
Okay, let's hear it.
I don't think it matters. And let me
Wow.
qualify that, because on the one hand, it matters very much depending on where you go with it. But my perspective on it is, I don't know which ones, or whether all of them did or not. I don't know whether they did or not. But I've come to the conclusion that I don't think it matters. And my opinion about that actually stems all the way back to an undergrad Bible class that I had. I went to Azusa Pacific and had an amazing Bible professor, Matt Hauge, and he spent all semester building up to this idea that historicity is not the same thing as truth. In other words, whether these stories factually happened or not, whether we could take a time machine and witness them happening or not, is not the same as whether or not they are true. So to use the flood as an example, whether that happened exactly as it's written, whether we could go back in time and meet Noah and spend those weeks and months sheltering in place with him on the ark,
Mm-hmm.
or not, that story is true regardless. And I think the way we interpret that truth is, we just saw, there are lots of ways we can interpret that. I think God's mercy and his faithfulness and his covenant promise to us is really at the core of that story. But getting back to that question, whether these stories in the Old Testament happened or not doesn't make them less true.
You know, Matt, it's a great way to basically just stop our podcast short in its tracks. Because what do you say to that? I mean, that's like the ultimate closer. But you're right. I think there's something very, very real about that. Early in my Christianity, I used to think this stuff mattered greatly. I remember dating a girl and breaking up with her because she had a different view on whether we should take the Bible literally on these things. And my thought was, well, if you don't believe that the flood happened, what's going to happen when we're married? By the way, I was like 16. What's going to happen when we're married someday? And we have to make a decision about how to live our lives. And you don't think you're going to take that next part, as truth or literally. Now, as a 47-year-old, by the way, I think I called myself 48 the other day. My daughter reminded me I'm only 47.
Yeah, not
so
yet.
I'm 1 year. Jodie, you're my age, right? You're the same age as me.
I'm not there yet.
There are a few of us on staff. Andrea, Jodie, myself, Nancy Marina. We're all the same age. I think Nancy may have a couple months on the rest of us. Anyway, where was I going with that?
It does
I
matter.
know.
When you were 16.
I thought it mattered greatly.
Yeah.
And now I look at this and I go, you know what? It's okay if you can't get there to a place of believing that that everything we read in the Old Testament needs to be taken literally or as factual. There are a handful of ways that we can try to understand that Noah's Ark story. And you're no less of a Christian or a follower of Jesus if you think it's taken a little bit differently than I do. For example, let's just use Noah's Ark for a second. I mean, there are some who would say, yeah, it's literal. A flood covered the entire earth. The whole globe was covered in water. Then there are others who would say, well, there was a localized flood. And that flood was covering the entire earth that no one knew of at the time. Right? The earth as he understood it. And that it's okay if we disagree on that. Well, then why is it not also okay if maybe somebody says, yeah, maybe that flood actually didn't happen, but that was an ancient person's explanation of what was going on around them in their understanding of how they got to where they got with God. I don't know that any of that matters when it comes to what it means to become a follower of Jesus.
I agree.
Long
I agree.
pause on podcast.
I had a similar experience. That class that I mentioned in undergrad, going into that class, I had a very different perspective. I had similar perspective to you, Chris. I thought everything in the Old Testament read like a history book as we've come to understand history. More on that in a minute, because I think that's part of the problem too. But I had this understanding that everything in the Old Testament had to have factually had to have happened. And why I think this question does matter is because within my worldview and how I understood the Bible, if the flood didn't actually happen, then that called into question the truth of everything. If the flood didn't happen, in my mind, I equated something happening with it being true. And so if this didn't happen, it meant it wasn't true, which means how can I know if any of this is true? So it was really a challenging process.
Or we were taught to kind of look at the Bible as one eyewitness account, like you would in a courtroom. And if this part of someone's testimony is false, then we should throw away the whole testimony. And yet that's not what the Bible is. It's many, 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 many people's testimonies about many different events. And you can't throw the whole thing out. You can't throw out the Gospels and their account of Jesus dying on a cross, being risen, because you got 4 different versions of that, because somebody's testimony about whether a guy got swallowed by a whale is, in your mind, accurate.
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to levels of truth. And I think when I started reading the Old Testament through that lens, like not so much as this, because same as you both, I believe I would have defended it and gone to my grave defending that everything in the Old Testament happened exactly as it was written. Mm-hmm. And I think that once I stopped defending the Bible like that and started reading it with layers and kind of peeling back layers and looking at nuance and reading it that way, and even seeing how I was told to never do this as I read the Old Testament, never read it through the eyes of the New Testament. Just read it for what it is. And I always tried to do that, but I don't know how you can, because of the layers of truth and nuance that it points to God, and it does point to Jesus, right? Which is why you can't throw it out. Whether it happened or not, it's still authoritative because of that. There is a inspired truth in there for us to uncover that God, I still believe it is inspired. I still believe it is authoritative.
There's a reason that it's there. Yeah.
Yes.
And the point of the Jonah story is to show not that there's a fish big enough to swallow a man, that he could live in it, get spit out. The point of that story is to talk about what it means to follow God, to run away, to be caught by him and swept back into his mission for you, to say yes to God and all of that. The point of that is to show God's deep, deep love for lost people. And the danger is that we think that the Jonah story is about that event and not the rest of it. Yeah.
Right. And the beauty is when Jesus comes on the scene, you see the embodiment of all of those things that you read and the layers of things you peel back in the Old Testament. You see so much of that embodied in Jesus.
Yeah. So I think just kind of in wrapping this up a little bit, here's a thought I would just kind of give in all of this. CrossWinds is a little bit of a different kind of place. What I mean is we've always called ourselves an interdenominational church. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is that we have people from all sorts of faith backgrounds, and then many from no faith background at all. And, I grew up Southern Baptist. You did as well, Jodie. Mm-hmm. I know how we would have answered this in the church that I grew up in. We would have said, absolutely, it's factual. There's no question about any of these things. Matt, did you grow up in a certain kind of denominational church at all? Or?
I grew up Baptist also.
Okay, so would your church have said the same thing then?
Absolutely.
Growing up? Okay. And yet I know as well that we've got people on our staff and our elder board and in our church who grew up in a Presbyterian background that might have answered this question a little bit more like how some of us are answering it right now. I know people who've grown up in a Lutheran background who would have answered it differently, Methodist background, Catholic background that would have answered it differently. I don't mean to say that your answer ultimately comes down to what your background is. I just mean to say at this church, there's room for all of those views. There's room for all of those views and understandings. It's why we say a lot around here that we agree to disagree. But I also know that when we do podcasts like this, we've got people who listen who are maybe not from CrossWinds, but are just kind of curious and interested in the topic. And I would say that just be cautious as you explore some of these things in your faith community. There may not be that kind of openness, and it might even be deemed as a threat to suggest that some of these things are not factual. Because the 16-year-old me would have been very threatened at that. Thank God the 16-year-old me wasn't a pastor. But I think that the 24-year-old me might have been a little bit threatened by that. And it's one of the things I love about this place is we all have such different thoughts on this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I think my 30-year-old me might have been very defensive of some of the things I'm saying or that we have said. So, It's a journey for everybody, and I think that's the other thing I'd say too is it's a journey to you don't just click over one day and go, oh, okay, I see it this way. You got to spend some time kind of needling around and wrestling. Again, we're so much about the wrestling here at CrossWinds and not telling people what to believe, but get in there and wrestle with it. That's where your growth comes from.
And if I can just kind of read into what is often behind this kind of question that we get, often it's someone who has come to the place where they've realized, I don't think I can believe that this is factual anymore. And I'm asking you, pastors, because am I allowed to still go to church here? Or am I really still a Christian if I'm struggling with believing that this is factual? And I think part of why as pastors we're so drawn to answers like the ones we all just gave is because we deeply want people to know this is not a decider in whether or not you're supposed to be a part of the people of Jesus, where you land on whether this is factual or not.
Yeah, Peter Enns is a guy who's written a cool book out there called, what's it called? I can't remember the title. The Bible Tells Me So.
Yeah.
And I think
then the subtitle is the best part, which is why defending the Bible has made it impossible to read it.
Yes. But one of his final statements in the book, he says something like a disrupted faith or an unsettled faith is a maturing faith. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at too, Chris. It's it's okay to question. It's okay to ask and wrestle with some of these things that were maybe once absolutes in your mind. Yep. Maybe they're not so much anymore. It's okay.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for joining in on the Tough Questions podcast. We appreciate it. And we'll do another one soon. This will be fun. We can keep going with these. Yep. Also, Jodie, if you have a better guacamole recipe than the just add garlic salt.
All right.
Love that.
I'm on it.
All right, guys. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.